So I'm at my public health banquet last week, and become friends with a lot of the people in my program. But some of them I've become friends with on like a professional level, in the sense that all of us see each other 3-4 times a week. So are in a party sort of mood. We're celebrating. It's the end of the year, which doesn't make sense why they threw it 2 weeks before finals, but whatever. And we're going around, we're sharing our favorite activities, and there's this girl in the group who I have recently become better friends with. And by recently, I mean since this banquet. She's a cool bitch. And we were talking about like fun activities that we do on a regular basis. She's like, "Oh, I play fiery tennis." And I don't even think she called it that, but she had a different name for it. But I was like, "What is that?" She's like, "Well, you know how when you go on dates and you meet like fun people and you do different things you wouldn't normally do because you're with different people." And I was like, "Yeah, that's what I like about, dating." And she's like, "Yeah, well, this guy, we didn't know what to do, and so we decided that we were going to throw like lighter fluid on some tennis balls and light them on fire and then play tennis with them." And I was like, "We could never do that in Arizona."
Setting aside multiple aspects of that anecdote, one that feels like a great way to ruin some tennis balls. Which, come on, California, you guys are supposed to be environmentally responsible. But also, like, if you don't hit the tennis ball and it hits you, doesn't that mean you suddenly have lighter fluid that's on fire on your clothing?
That's the whole point of the game. You're like, which was kind of weird. I'm thinking back on it. I'm like, why did the guy have lighter fluid in his car in the first place? But whatever. We're moving on.
Wow. People wonder why it is we're seeing so many new wildfires in the last couple of years, and it has nothing to do with many months in the last decade being the hottest years on record ever recorded. It has a lot to do with the rise of fiery tennis,
Fiery
the
tennis,
TikTok
man.
challenge that's sweeping the nation. Welcome back, dear listeners, to another episode of Why Won't No One Date These Guys. It's part podcast, part meditative reflection on the nature of existence, part Joel testing out new voices for his, voice acting career he eventually will move into. This week, we will be trying a very special drink. Before we do that, Naomi, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Naomi Guy, and this is Why Would No One Date These Guys?
We exist. So Naomi, we're going in a different direction, and I should set this drink up with a little bit of context. When Lauren was in law school and studying for the bar, she had to drink a lot of caffeine. And the way she consumed a majority of that caffeine was Monster energy drinks. And she claims she has tried over 40 flavors of Monster drink. Now, someone out there is going to go, au contraire, Joel, they only sell 34 flavors right now. And to that, I would say that is true, except that they've discontinued a number of flavors, and there are regionally specific ones she was able to find. So with that in mind, I am trying Monster Energy today, Ultraviolet. The Ultra brand, I believe, are all sugar-free, so I can drink this with absolutely no repercussions to my health. It has such amazing ingredients as cyanocobalamin, or vitamin B12. I gotta say, Naomi, I've had this before. I had one the other day because we bought a multi-pack at the store, and I felt like I had injected nitrous into my veins. I was a god. I could do anything. I could bend steel in my bare hands. There was elation. There was energy. We are 5 minutes into a podcast and I haven't consumed it. I should probably take a swig. Not bad. It's got like a very vague berry flavor. Um, a lot of energy drinks I've tried kind of taste like battery acid. So the fact that I don't immediately spit this out is pretty good. But yeah, the euphoria that comes with consuming a whole can of Monster Energy is pretty incredible. So I would urge anyone who feels like they've aged out of this world, that it's all downhill from here. It's only going to be creaks and aches and pains moving forward. Try yourself a Monster Energy and you will think differently. I assure you of
There's
that.
this local in Phoenix. There's this local coffee brand, and we had Len and I when we were living in Phoenix. We had a couple of cans of like cold brew concentrate, like in the cans in our fridge, and our brother, Joel and I's brother, came to visit, and
Frederick.
we were like, you can help yourself to anything in the kitchen, but we didn't give him the warning of, you have to mix this concentrate or else you'll literally probably die, because there's, I think, 3 servings in a small can, like a typical Diet Coke can, like size can, and you're only supposed to have about 5 ounces of it or so, probably less. You're supposed to mix it with water and cream or whatever. And so we didn't tell him that. So I came home from work and he was like he was literally like shaking. Like he looked like he was high or something. And I was like, what is going on? He's like, I had one of those cans and it was so great. I'm like buzzing right now. And I was like, okay, whoa, calm down. And then we went
Damn.
through the whole conversation of, did you mix it with anything? And he's like, no, I just drank it straight. And I was like, you drank it straight out of the can? That's disgusting. So, yeah, don't do that.
That's the story of our brother becoming a hummingbird.
Yeah.
He flew away and we haven't seen him since. Naomi, we are back to discuss the book Sex Talks. No, we're not just here to discuss the book Sex Talks. Why would I say that? We're here to discuss the book How Sex Changed the Internet and the Internet Changed Sex by Samantha Cole. This is part 2 of, I don't know, doesn't need to be a particularly long session. We could do 2 or 3 parts out of this. But last time we discussed the first part of the book, and I'm wondering if you could briefly summarize that for listeners.
Yeah, so basically, we discussed how at the beginning of the internet, there wasn't a lot of like, um, I don't want to say censorship, but there was a lot of lawmakers that were having issues with the internet and it being, existing in this world.
The porn. It was
I'm not
mostly the
even I'm
porn.
not even discussing that yet. I'm just talking about, the
Okay.
laws that they tried to pass that would hold the people responsible for the website that you were on for the content that people were posting on said website, and that became a no-no. So they what is now known to the world today is just the fact that you can log on to any website and say anything, and Facebook or Instagram or MySpace or whatever you're using isn't held liable. The next thing is lawmakers didn't like the amount of porn that you could access on the internet for a variety of reasons, and so the they would go around and try to get their friends to say no to porn on the internet. And how they would do this was carry around a very large binder of porn and go into the coat closet on the house floor and you know show them the porn and be like, isn't this disgusting? Oh, she's got big boobs, let me look at this more. So true story.
This is real text. These are transcripts. You can read them in the congressional
Exactly.
record.
And the third and final point is just the fact that early chat rooms were a really good source of information, especially for people that were, in rural areas that didn't have access to, proper sexual education, for instance. One of the first major chat rooms was a really good place for education about AIDS, and just being in the LGBTQ community and learning more about things like that. So that's the basic summary that I have for you.
Cool. Let's get right back to it. Naomi, today we're going to talk about the earliest images on the internet. And there's some very fascinating history I had no idea about and how images came to be. So, in 1972, Lena Schijublom took a modeling gig with Playboy, posed for a nude photo, got a paycheck, and moved on with her life. So she was 21 years old at the time. She was Swedish, was new to the United States, and had just married and lived with her first husband in Chicago when he suggested she sign up with a local modeling agency to bring home extra cash. She had done some fashion modeling before, and eventually, through a connection with a photographer, became Playboy's Miss November 1972 centerfold. It was the first and last time she posed nude. She turned down a personal invitation from Hugh Hefner to visit his mansion, and that's a very smart move. She took more gigs with Kodak, posing for Shirley cards that helped technicians calibrate the lighting and color balances on film. Her friends thought, oh boy, this is going to be a difficult day to get through.
I think it's the Monster Energy drink. It's just getting to you already.
Her friends thought that the Playboy anecdote was a fun bit of trivia, but for Lena, that photo was in the past. But for the rest of the world, Lena's photo was literally changing the internet. A few months after the issue of Playboy hit stands, at the University of Southern California's Signal and Image Processing Institute, electrical engineer Alexander Sawchuk and his team were working on image processing algorithms for computers. They used test images, a specific set of photos shared across imaging labs, so that each lab was working from the same standard, to put their image compression algorithms through their paces. The team's work would eventually contribute to the development of the JPEG file format, one of the most common image formats we still use today. None of the historical retellings of Lena's story seem to include or wants to reveal who exactly brought a Playboy to work with them that day. But most accounts agree that when they needed a new image to scan into a Hewlett-Packard 2100 mini computer, the November 1972 issue of Playboy was chosen for convenience. They were bored with the old test images and wanted a photo with a human face, interesting textures, and a glossy finish to test the limits of the technology. The centerfold was perfect. They cut her photo out of the magazine from her shoulders up, effectively making the photo safe for work. Some have attributed the crop job to taste or tact. More likely, it was a technical matter. The top 5.12 inches of the page fit into the scanner that they were using, making it a 512 by 512 pixel image. The image suited their purposes so well, they gave the scans to other researchers working on similar image processing tasks, and eventually traveled so widely it was accepted as a standard in the industry. There were other test images in use at the time, but Lena became the established standard that labs across the country could agree upon. Part of her enduring legacy is propelled by controversy. Over the course of 2 decades, her image spread quietly and uncontrollably before Playboy even noticed. By the time the publisher did notice, when the trade magazine Optical Engineering put her on their July cover in 1991, it was too late for them to try to reel her back in. The publisher gave permission for educational and research purposes. But copyright violation wasn't the cause for contention. With the tech world's dot-com explosion offering promising futures for all at the same time, women were world building, moderating, and hosting servers, MUDs, and their own websites right there with the old boys club. But women, if you can imagine this, Naomi, women were still not seen as equal competitors and colleagues with their male counterparts in the computing workforce. The Lena test image, some argued, was just another artifact of the carelessly patriarchal thinking that had ruled the last 30 years. Some demanded the image be retired. Editor-in-chief of the industry journal IEEE Transactions on Image Processing, David Munson Jr. wrote an open letter addressing those complaints in 1996. His verdict was not to censor uses of Lena, but if there were other equally useful options available, researchers should opt for those instead. In cases where another image will serve your purpose equally well, why not use that other image? He wrote this in 1991, and the issue appeared settled. 1996, and the issue appeared settled. So Lena, for the last 35 years, has been living blissfully unaware that her image has been used by computer researchers to calibrate equipment and judge the efficacy of image compression software, right? You have this incredibly high resolution image that a lot of people have access to, and if you want to test how well your computer program works at compressing, you can compare how it shows up on your computer screen with the actual image from this November 1972 copy. So it's like kind of a clever way of, calibrating and determining efficiency of programs, but it also is using this like quote unquote tastefully cut photo of a woman who has no idea any of this is going on. For years, she had no idea this was going on and was living quietly in Sweden. It wasn't until she was invited to the 50th annual conference of the Society for Imaging, Image, and Technology in 1997 that she understood the scope at which her image was being used, let alone as the gold standard. She had never accessed the internet before then. The conference was a surreal image for Lena, mainly because all these people, mostly white male engineers, had never considered her real physical existence before. They were meeting the weird science woman of their academia days, a set of pixels and colors they'd studied closely but never saw as part of the whole woman, as part of a whole human. In 2019 documentary about the Playboy Image's legacy, Losing Lena, Lena is quoted as saying, "It was strange to have all these people come up to me and say, 'Oh, that's weird. You're a real person.'" Um, so I'm going to hold up an image that none of our listeners will be able to see. This is a comparison of different types of image compression using the Lena scan. You can tell, obviously, there were advancements in how efficient the computers were at rendering the image, as well as how well they were able to compress it. But it makes the point, this was used as the standard across decades and decades in order to compress imagery. So in 2015, Maddie Zug, a senior at the Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, wrote an op ed to the Washington Post about her experience as one of the female peers assigned to use the Lena image for a coding project. The teacher in this class warned them to not look up the image. Of course, the first thing that every person in this class did was search for the original and pull up the whole centerfold on their screens. At the time, I was 16 and struggling to believe that I belonged in a male dominated computer science class, Zug wrote. I tried to tune out the boys' sexual comments. Why is an advanced science, technology, engineering, and mathematics school using a Playboy centerfold in its classrooms? Today, female technology students still have many of the same complaints as they have from the beginning. Gender wage gaps, male skewed advancement opportunities, and sexist attitudes still thrive in tech. Having to sit through a computing class where a story about a huddle of men and their unaware Playboy playmate is the week's lesson, is salt in the wound. So, though now in her 70s and a grandmother, Lena seems to hold few strong opinions on the use of her image. The test image still haunts her modern machines, but current image processing researchers rarely use her in their papers. Many people are pointing out that the image is kind of antiquated just because the resolution is so low, and so it's better probably to use higher resolution imagery in order to take the same quality of photos. In his 2018 farewell letter as editor in chief of IEEE transactions, Scott Acton urged his colleagues to think outside the old standby. The Lena crop contains around 260,000 pixels, pretty good for her time. An image from the iPhone 11, released in 2019, contains more than 12 million pixels. So it makes a lot of sense to retire that image and start using something with much higher resolution if you want to continue testing and calibrating image systems. But that is one of the first stories about images on the internet and how the technology emerged. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's just so interesting the fact that they didn't catch that she was being used as what we know as the JPEG file now until it was being published for another reason. Like it's crazy to me to think that, we they didn't have access to that information because now if, something like that happened, we just hop on the internet and find it in a couple of minutes. But it's just interesting that it took so long to figure that out.
I was reading that anecdote and thinking to myself, it reminded me a lot of Henrietta Lacks.
Yes, I was literally thinking the same thing. So Henrietta Lacks is went in to the Mayo Clinic in believe it was Baltimore. And it was a black woman and she went in and was diagnosed with cancer. So they took some samples from her and then
This was like the 1950s, right?
yes, I believe so. And
Okay.
they took some samples from her and some cell samples and took it to a lab and were testing them. And then as her cells were growing at an extreme rate, it was the fastest they'd ever seen them grow. They started to test her cells without her consent, and decided that they were going to disperse these cells to different scientists across the world. And her cells were growing at a rate that, it was extremely unprecedented. And everyone wanted to get their hands on these cells. And without the consent of her or her family, they were dispersing them at a very large rate. So then 30 plus years later, Henrietta had passed away from said cancer, and there was a scientist that reached out to her kids and were like, "Hey, we want to know, if you have this cancer, and we want to test you." But the thing is that their father, Henrietta's husband, had a like fourth grade education level. So he didn't understand a single thing they were saying. And he thought that what they were saying was she was still like in a lab somewhere and they were just testing her. And so, like doing experiments on her. And so it got really ugly for a while. And then the family found out that they had been testing Henrietta's cells and dispersing them as they thought necessary for 30 plus years. And they were a part of a $1 billion+ industry. Her cells were, and created this giant industry, and they got nothing out of it. And without Henrietta's consent, they continued to do tests on her cells.
Yeah, I think the point, the reason this anecdote is included by Samantha Cole is the idea that fundamentally a lot of technology is built upon exploitation of other people. And like you can say, oh, well, Lena didn't really care about it. But there's probably, dozens of other examples of, women's images, women's intimate videos, whatever being used as like calibration for video encoding technology or, upload download services or something like that. And so it's problematic when, the industry is built upon exploitation of someone who doesn't really have any say, and people get insanely wealthy, and research is pushed in all sorts of directions without those persons' contributions being recognized. And I think it's important to note here that, like, unfortunately, I kind of think this is the rule, not the exception. You can think about all sorts of examples in our modern world where there's venture capital that's running these companies, like Spotify, where the guy who's in charge of Spotify, he doesn't make music, right? He doesn't produce music. All he does is like combine music into a platform that people can access. And he's made multiple derisive comments about, oh, making music is, low cost, it's easy, we should. Oh man, that monster's coming back. Yeah, making music is easy, making music isn't difficult, making music requires no resources, we shouldn't have to compensate the majority of artists because artists only do this because they enjoy making art, right? No one's actually in this to make money. And it's, just like completely stupid comments from someone who knows nothing about the industry. But whether it's like actual ignorance or willful ignorance, so he doesn't actually have to compensate people, it doesn't really matter, right? Because at the end of the day, what he's doing is sucking money out of creators' pockets. He's sucking those dividends and now is worth, hundreds of millions of dollars, and his company is worth billions of dollars as a result. And so it's frustrating that we see this repeated over and over again, where like people's creative work, people's, private information and possessions are taken and shared and used for other people's benefit without them as an individual ever really being considered. Maybe a theme that's going to define the internet, over this, book, but also, throughout the history of the internet. Okay, so we talked about image encoding, and like we're talking specifically about the idea that you can tell a computer, hey, I have all these pixels, arrange them in this manner, and it'll produce an image, right? And the images themselves are relatively small, 512 pixels by 512 pixels at the start, but they still require a decent amount of memory to store, and they require, a decent amount of time and processing power for the computer to kind of unpack the image and display it. We're talking super early computers, right? 1970s, 1980s. They're not what we think of now, where you're just, scrolling through a million photos on Instagram. We're very privileged to live in the state we live now. So the question, Naomi, is how did the earliest people display images on the internet before image encoding really existed? Do you know the answer to this?
No.
How do you transmit an image over the internet without having the technology to transmit the image?
I think you would send a telegraph.
Oh, that's interesting. A carrier pigeon with like a nude photo attached.
It's not the actual picture, it's just
Yeah.
a description in great detail of the picture.
Okay, so the answer is something called ASCII art. So this is something I'm only like vaguely aware of. I was not old enough to really enjoy ASCII art. I would look up, like video game guides on the internet, and every so often you'd see those using ASCII art. But the basic idea of ASCII art is you use letters and you string them together really closely together. And by increasing the density of these letters and alphanumeric characters, you can produce very detailed photos. And so people have been doing this for years. Poets were creating shapes from their text as early as ancient Greece, with Simmias of Rhodes arranging prose in the shape of A's and angels' wings. Islamic calligraphy's intricate script adorns courtyards and mosques, not as mere written words, but as artwork telling the story of high praise. So, before computer graphic capabilities became standard issue with home machines like the Apple II and the Commodore 64, people got creative with how they sent visual smut. Arranging slashes, dots, and lines into nipples and legs was a creative way to get porn across the internet before image processing. But text based nudes weren't crude digital cave paintings, they were intricate, realistic representations of the real thing. So, ASCII art, ASCII, is considered to be the first visual porn that was delivered on the internet. Instead of having to tell a computer, I need you to load 260,000 pixels, you could tell a computer to load a couple of hundred individual alphanumeric characters. And the big difference there is one of those does not require nearly as much space and can be sent in the exact same way as you would send any other message, like through a chat room or a forum that we discussed in the previous part. So this is how like the earliest form of imagery was sent across the internet. People would create these incredibly intricate depictions of other human beings, either copying from an image or creating something completely wholesale, and then they would upload this to a forum post, and other people would be able to download it. When they downloaded the chats, and they'd see oh man, boobs made out of Q's and X's and P's, and yeah, just crazy stuff. I have no idea how long it would take someone to, create an image like this. I know nowadays there are programs where you can take an image and it'll turn it into ASCII art. It'll compare the shading in one area and be like, okay, we can use a slash there, and the shading in another area, we're gonna have to use a question mark there. But yeah, having to do it from hand, that's just
It's
crazy.
kind of like, those pictures that are made up of tiny little pictures or made up of other things like buttons or something, and
Yeah.
then they're made into like a picture of Marilyn Monroe or something. Like that's what I think about.
Yeah, I think that's a similar comparison, though obviously that would require, a crazy amount of processing power that just, still isn't available at this point in time. The other big way that images were transmitted in the early days of the internet was not from one computer to one computer, but rather in the form of CD-ROMs. And this is a cute section that Samantha has written called CD-ROMs, SEEDY, talking about the prevalence of porn in the CD-ROM industry. Initially, the adult entertainment industry was like incredibly scared of this new emerging industry because the majority of the digital sex entertainment industry was built on piracy. Someone would go and find a bunch of images, and they would pirate them to a CD and then distribute that to other people. And that's primarily how people got their like digital content before image encoding became more popular. You'd have to individually load it onto either floppy disks or to CD-ROMs and then sell it to someone in a physical form, and they would upload it to their computer. And they could theoretically rip that information, turn it into a file, and upload it to one of the forums. It's just with the computer download speeds being what they were back in the day, this just took forever. And if you wanted to get like a decent collection of porn, you would have to buy a physical something at some point from somebody. So yeah, they did all sorts of stuff at these initial adult expos, and the adult expos actually pioneered a lot of the technology that we think of as like defining the early days of the internet. So there were revolutionary creations like spreadsheets and Ethernet. The show advanced in 1992 to futuristic leaps, like IBM's unveiling of its speech command software. In 1993, the New York Times had noted that adult-themed multimedia CD-ROMs were one of the newcomers at the Comdex show. So initially, it was just like normal computer software, and then the pornographers came in to run their own kind of version. And it was apparently a very gross spectacle of just groups of men waving wads of cash and trying to take a look at the strippers that these adult entertainment digital guys had hired in order to show off their wares. So initially, the computer software industry, as well as the adult entertainment industry, was very skeptical of these people coming in. They felt that software was kind of a clean industry. They felt that they didn't want to bring these other people in and bring down the quality of what the industry was seen as. Obviously, there was also a push during this period to regulate the internet, and so they didn't like the associations of having a bunch of strippers around as Microsoft debuted spreadsheets or whatever. But they unfortunately had a lot of money, and so they continued to show up year after year. initially they were moved to the basement beneath the main conference. You have to go down like a flight of sketchy stairs in order to access all these exhibitors. But what they did is they changed their focus from being part of the computer entertainment industry to being their own separate industry and created adult decks in 1994. So that's where the first like major adult entertainment group came from. Yeah, these people were making money hand over fist because again, they're pretty much paying nothing for content. They're just like downloading stuff, ripping it to the CDs, and then duplicating the CDs as they distribute them. Um, they made $260 million in 1994. And sometimes it would be just CDs with image files on them. Sometimes it would be the most basic computer sex games imaginable with titles like Virtual Valerie, Samurai Pervert, and Porno Poker. These cost, and this was in $1990, between $4 and $80, right?
What
So we're looking at,
what could you get for $4 and what were you buying for 1990 dollars?
that's a good question, right? I assume there's a quality tier
Yeah.
with certain people who are known for producing better stuff. Maybe there's more space on an $80 disc. I don't know enough about the differences between early storage. I couldn't say for certain. You could rent them from like adult movie stores. You could walk into your sketchy X-rated film store down the street and check this out and return it a couple weeks later. You could also purchase them from racks in these stores as well. Yeah, keep in mind that we're talking $4 to $80, but that's
Yeah.
$1990.
$80.
Significantly more expensive.
$80 would be 191 today. And all I'm saying, that's crazy. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. The other big thing that was being sold at the time, besides like actual CDs, was early technology. So digital sexations exhibited at one of these conferences a dildo device, a piece of hardware you would attach to the back of a computer that they claim could control sex toys over the internet in real time. So that was like the first major like sex toy innovation. There's also Sexy Servers, a sex friendly web hosting firm that networked mainstream connections for its real time video conferencing software at a moment when real time video was unheard of for most of the internet connected world. Other people, and this is where I think a lot of the money came from, sold adult websites for as much as $5,000 to pornographers who wanted to mimic the success of other webmasters. So one person opens a adult themed website and they start making a bunch of money. And then other people see that and are like, oh, if I steal a bunch of content and upload that to my own website, I could also make a lot of money. And keep in mind, this is intersecting with, the .com boom. So you're seeing a bunch of people all rushing to the internet trying to make money. And, if you run an adult entertainment website, not only are you almost practically guaranteed to get a lot of hits, you also can probably get decent advertising from, all these other companies, all these startups that want to, promote themselves like the next big thing on the internet. Yeah, so it's fascinating to me. That's you have this intersection between the main computer tech industry and then the adult tech industry that eventually bisects into these own two separate things. Unfortunately, Comdex, which was the main computer tech conference, found very quickly how much money they were losing. It turns out that a lot of people were showing up to this conference just to see the adult offerings. They didn't actually care about anything else. But then also they were losing a bunch of money from exhibitors who had significant funding because they were running these incredibly profitable porn websites. And so the initial year that they had banned the adult portion, they lost $500,000. You can argue that this may or may not have been a good decision because the computer tech industry obviously had a vested interest in keeping their image squeaky clean. If they were seen as associating with the adult side of the industry, they may have lost credibility in the eyes of the government, and there may have been additional regulations placed upon them. But it's certainly the case that from the early days of the internet to the present, there has been an attempt by major companies to not have the seedier sides of the internet represented in a mainstream way. And I think that's fascinating because one of the big reasons people continue to go to the internet is for the seedy sides of the internet. And the fact that no one wants to, really dig down into that and monetize it outside of a couple of sites like Pornhub is just, truly fascinating. Typically, there's this idea that when there is demand for a product, companies will come and fill that void. And in this specific section of the economy, that does not appear to be the case. Obviously, there's different rules surrounding porn on the internet. One of them involves banks banks don't like transactions that involve sex. They have, regulations, some of which are federally driven, some of which are just internal banking policies. And so I know there is a struggle to get adult websites that can accept MasterCard, Discover, Chase payments. But simultaneously, it's just fascinating to me that the industry has been around, for the better part of 30, 40 years, and there's still not, a vested interest in, software companies to try to carve out as much of the profit as they can from the most profitable aspects of this CD side of the internet. So, any thoughts on early technology and images on the internet?
I'm just still I don't think that, what was her name? Jenny?
Lena,
Um
Lena.
Lena? I don't think that she was okay with, everything that went down, but, you know, I think that's kind of like the cover story. I wouldn't be okay if something like that was
I think
okay.
I think we're looking at this from a modern lens, which is pretty much everyone on Earth has a phone or has access to the internet in some form, right?
Yeah.
In the early days of the internet, that was not the case, right? People were not talking about the internet in the same way. The internet was mostly something that, wealthier individuals, people who had access to computers were able to access. It was not nearly as ubiquitous, and a lot of people at the time kind of thought it was a fad. They didn't really see much of a difference between the internet and something like radio, because, you could have ham radio, and ham radio allows you to transmit with people all over the world. And so I can imagine a lot of people were just like, the kids these days, they'll get off the internet eventually. And so I
Yeah.
and she had a very similar thought where she was just didn't understand how many people were viewing her image and using her image and calibrating stuff with her image, because I would imagine, as someone who had never been on the internet, she just wouldn't know the extent of what it was, what it offered, and the different visual mediums it could present stuff in.
Yeah.
So let's get to the next chapter, and this is about making money selling sex on the internet and some of the earliest pioneers in that field. Now, we were talking a little bit about software companies, and let's bring it back down to the human level with individual people selling porn on the internet. So there was a couple in 1995 that purchased a giant computer tower and hauled it back to their North Baltimore apartment from Sears. So they had met in high school 3 years earlier, 1992, right after she had graduated, and they moved in a year later. They bought a giant computer in 1995, and almost immediately a whole new world opened up to them. Groups of people around the country on Usenet sharing their sexploits in storytelling and photos for the whole web to see. Now, this couple, Jen Peterson and Dave Miller, were already dabbling with taking their own nudes on film as part of their personal sex life. They'd shipped the rolls off to a liberal minded Seattle Filmworks for processing, so they jumped into the BBS forums and spent the summer writing out a historic heatwave, busily scanning and posting their own stack of film and prints to these groups. So they start out and they're like, oh, there are other perverts on the internet. This seems like fun. And they start scanning the photos that they've already taken as part of their own great sex life and posting them for free. Now, they had gathered a bit of a fan club by the end of the year, and so they set up their own corner of the internet for their images. They set up gin-dave.com, and though they resisted charging for access at first, staying afloat with visitor donations, they eventually bit the bullet and turned themselves into a true porn site, one that actually charged subscription fees. So, after the passage of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, they and hundreds of other adult sites set up credit card memberships as an age verification method. Fans of Jen and Dave's exploit could see their entire archive in one place for a credit card payment of $10 every 3 months. Okay? So for $40 a year, Naomi, you can see all these photos of this company having fun, exotic sex.
This is early OnlyFans.
This is very much like early OnlyFans. Naomi, in their first 3 weeks, they made $20,000. And this is 1990s dollars.
Oh my god.
Yeah,
Oh my
I heard
god.
this recently. This is not like a perfect thing, but it kind of gives you a way of like judging inflation, and that's the US dollar roughly halves in value every 20 years. So if it's been, say, 20 years since then, we can anticipate that was $40,000 in 3 weeks, and
So it's
probably
been
closer
like,
to 50,000 since it's been 30 years, right?
yeah. Yeah, so it's when I was looking at the calculator earlier, it's $1 now is equivalent to $2.40 in 1990.
Yeah. So you can tell there's a reason so many people were rushing to make money through sex on the internet, because the demand was there and the quality of a lot of places was pretty low. But then you also have to imagine that, like, even though there were a lot of like Usenet forums, BBS forums, you could download this content, it was incredibly slow. Right? You would have to be filtering through hundreds of photos, many of whom would take several minutes to load on your computer in order to find stuff that you actually wanted. So rather than doing all that work, what if you just paid someone and the content you wanted to see was already stored in one place, and you knew that really no matter what you were downloading, no matter what you were accessing on that website, it would be something you were interested in. So I could totally understand, why this was so popular. So the biggest problems in the first few years that successful adult websites were experiencing was keeping up with the demand for new content, paying a newly astronomical internet bill, and not downing servers with the influx of traffic in the process. So they were charging for access, and this did two things. The first thing was age verification. But the other thing, which was super important in the early internet in the 90s, was to throttle some of the bandwidth demands of their 25,000 visitors a day, right? So if you don't charge, anyone can access your group, which is good if you want to, become popular and you want lots of people to access your information. But it's also bad insofar as you're an individual website owner who then has to pay additional fees from companies in order to, rent out additional bandwidth capacity and server space, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so they did sign up for a internet service provider, Concentric Internet Services, which offered, quote, unlimited server space and traffic capabilities. But the traffic to their site was so intense that the company started to throttle the number of people that could access the server. They had a tense set of emails exchanged between Dave, the husband in this relationship, and the customer service team, and they changed their policies, he claims, specifically because they were costing that company so much money with their hosting of this pornographic content. So, until the 2000s, Samantha argues, spending money online for most people was a question of whether you would, not how much you would. Once you had the hardware set up and the technical knowledge for getting online, you could connect to the pre-web internet for free. So there were some BBS communities that required users to pay for subscriptions to offset admins' own time and expenses, but there were still news groups and multi-user games to be joined and played without cost. Anyone could theoretically develop their own plot of virtual land. Now, unfortunately, as we mentioned, there were costs that had to be covered. There were reasons people wanted to monetize this, but there also was the problem of the internet rapidly being gobbled up by larger corporations. So the digital wilderness was bought up by big companies in narrowing competition. By the mid 80s, there were three major players on the ISP field, each with their own distinct operational ethos. There was CompuServe, Prodigy, and AOL. There were others, but these three pulled ahead of the rest because they understood something fundamental about the nascent internet. Getting online offered something that watching TV or reading a newspaper couldn't: interactive connections to other people, conversations, and cultural moments you weren't privy to unless you were there online. Many people access MUDs and chat servers using these services. So this was still pre-World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee wouldn't invent what we think of as like the internet today until 1989. And a lot of this was happening in these kind of fragmented sections of the internet that sometimes were closed off and couldn't be accessed by others. The money being made and spent online at that time was primarily through subscription-based servers. With the advent of the web, the scene exploded like a piñata full of money. Suddenly, anyone with a little HTML experience or willingness to learn had a shot at bringing hundreds of thousands of visitors to their sites a month, and with their advertising and networking finesse, the chance to convert some of these visitors to cash. So rapidly, there began to be incredibly niche pornography that was available on the internet. One of them was a TechSign Girl website run by someone named Katie McPherson. Katie was popular because she would rush onto the campuses of larger computer companies. Think about, Xerox, Yahoo, Lycos, Sun Microsystems, and she would flash the camera that was taking photos of her next to the signs of these giant companies. So imagine, like naked women next to a Google sign or a Facebook sign or something these days. This was, very popular among nerds, if you can imagine such a thing.
I'm just imagining like, oh yeah, let me see a naked girl next to the Google sign.
Yeah. There were a lot of strippers and former strippers who realized they would have a lot more control over their autonomy if they ran their own websites. And so some of them taught themselves programming and put together their own sites, like Jen and Dave, which allowed them to, control the visitors, sell it for as much as they wanted. They would have a reliable stream of income, which couldn't be guaranteed in the stripper industry. And they could use, their resource, their body, obviously, to make money and sell it to a lot more people than they could, working at a single club. So again, as you said, this is a lot like OnlyFans. There also were directories that popped up, and directories alone were considered like very valuable because you have this internet which doesn't have a lot of good ways to search through it. Like the concept of search engines really didn't exist at this point. And so what you'd have is these directory pages you'd go to, which had thousands of websites that were categorized, and they would tell you, oh, you can access this sort of content at this website. And, these are the sites that require you to pay, but this is the content that they provide here. And again, this is a very useful resource for people who want to get the most bang for their buck, so to speak, on the early internet. And so these directories alone, just places where you could click links, were making tens of thousands of dollars a month because so many people were visiting them and there was so much value in placing ads on the side here. Yahoo was a link directory at first. It was a good example of how link directories worked, but it was a well-funded and staffed one compared to a lot of these that were just run by, one or two people. In the mid-90s, it was the first stop for people looking for websites in specific categories. Now, this was everything. It wasn't specifically porn, but they definitely made money off of the adult side of things. Under adult picture gallery sites, for instance, you could narrow your search down to BDSM, amateur, vintage, nude celebrities, and so much more. Running link directories was kind of tedious work. Webmasters had to keep their site updated with new content to keep visitors coming back and continuously check each of the links hosted to make sure that they were still working. So many people started their own sites in bids to play the adult web lotto of fame, and sites were constantly dying and popping back up. So some people, such as I think Beth Mansfield, who ran Persian Kitty, a link directory of adult websites, said that she spent 6 hours a day vetting the site every single day, just clicking and re-clicking links over and over again, making sure things were still up. By 1998, Beth Mansfield claimed she was netting $93,000 a month every single year. She was getting buyout offers in the millions every single week, but always turned them down. And I think there's this thing where a lot of women enjoy the kind of empowerment. They get to be anonymous. They don't have to deal with harassment when they're running these sites. And they also, running their own business and have the opportunity to become the master of their own domain, so to speak, in a way they really can't in like the physical world and the real world industries. Yeah, this chapter goes on for quite a while, and it discusses kind of the twists and turns as this was going on. Models who were running their own websites, obviously existed, as I mentioned, but the book points out they were probably kind of the minority because it was much easier to just steal content from other people's websites and repost it on your own than actually produce new content yourself. And so while there are certainly people who are willing to pay for these models' content and having a wide variety there, more often than not their content would be stolen and put on other blogs that would become more popular than their own. The visitors that independent sites attracted were only a fraction of audience big enterprise magazines once the big boys in the adult entertainment industry came to town. So Playboy came online in 1994 and saw more than 4.3 million visitors a month. It made money the same way independent models and webmasters did through ad revenue and memberships to the website. So for a decade prior, print magazines like Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler had been competing over aesthetics. Hugh Hefner's vision for a more discerning men's magazine, less peep show and more parlor, drove the initial success of Playboy. Like, Playboy was considered kind of like a gentleman's magazine, not in like a sketchy way, and literally like this is a magazine for people who like to smoke pipes and have like philosophical chats about the state of the world. And it's fascinating if you go back to like early issues of Playboy, there are interviews with like black radicals. There are interviews with like incredibly interesting philosophers and progressive individuals reshaping the country. And Playboy, obviously has titillating images as well, but they were trying to always blend the titillating images with this like kind of veneer of intellectualism, right? It's like, I read Playboy for the articles, and that would actually be a thing you could say just because the content was so like in depth. So initially, Playboy was resistant to kind of, lean more into the seedier side of the internet. But when other websites started publishing more and more hardcore photos, his vision wavered. On the internet, the pressure to push everything to the limits of shock value was even more intense. Every website was in competition with every other website on the planet, and if one site cut its prices, it undercut hundreds of others. So Playboy eventually gives in and starts doing the exact same content as everyone else. And I do genuinely think the brand suffered as a result because they no longer had this kind of intellectual undercurrent. They weren't publishing articles like, BLM and what it moves for the future of, interracial politics or something. It was like, interracial girls, live, live, live. I don't know. Any thoughts on this, Naomi? Where are we?
I think it's interesting that from what I can tell, Playboy was so late to the game. Penthouse was so late to the
Mm.
game to like cuz nowadays it's, every big company is quick to make a change and quick to turn around.
Mm.
But I mean, I guess the like you mentioned, like this was like a fad and people thought this was a fad and people it wasn't accessed by everyone. So, I just think that's interesting that it wasn't, um they weren't trying to create like this new kind of content immediately.
Yeah. I think legacy institutions, there are a lot of examples of them being resistant to change and kind of being left behind because the people in charge of them will often be people who have been in the ad industry or working at that specific company for 20, 30 years. And they have a very specific idea about what they do and where they can make money. And so when a new technology comes along, they may either have absolutely no idea how to utilize that technology, they might be scared of the technology and not willing to admit their ignorance and turn over the reins to someone who's younger than them who can run it. Or they genuinely might think, as you say, that it's a fad and be like, yeah, it'll go away, never be super popular. And I think at the point where you have media starting to discuss, oh, did you know people can make money on the internet? That's when they'll start paying attention. But that's also the point where, this has been going on for a decade or more, right? The media doesn't typically come at the cusp of these things. It comes once that thing has kind of become mainstream. And so I think, a lot of institutions like Playboy were caught flat footed just because they genuinely didn't understand that people would, enjoy using the internet in this way. And I think you can make good arguments for why they wouldn't reasonably expect people to want to use the internet for porn, right? If you have a Playboy in front of you, you have a physical thing. There's a nude photo and an image. You turn the page, it takes a fraction of a second, there's another nude photo. On the internet, however, you have a nude image in front of you, you click another one. It might take a minute and a half to load,
I
right?
would say more
That's
than that. I would say it take a while to buffer.
Yeah. And so I can imagine, some executive looking at this be like, no one's ever going to want to use that. That's ridiculous, right? But simultaneously, even though that's a much worse user experience, there's a novelty to it, right? There's the sense of anticipation of having no idea what could be in that image as it loads. There's the sense of, like, oh, I have access to everything compared to, again, a single magazine and the content contained within. So I think you could make genuinely good arguments at the time, and maybe unfair of us to judge them from kind of this historical lens, but still kind of funny, as you point out, that so many other people were making money prior to them gaining control. So there is this other part of like all these adult websites going online, and that is them pioneering new technologies in order to reduce risk for customers and to make as much money as they could. So advertising on the web was still very new in the mid 90s. And a lot of sites tried to draw an analogy between the magazine and newspaper ad of print to the internet with aforementioned banner ads. But that advertising was based on visitors, such as, you are the 985th visitor to this page counters that used to appear on websites. They were counting the number of hits or requests from one visitor's browser to the website server. Some counters inflated those numbers by including images in hit counts so that every graphic that loaded on the page was a hit and the web itself was a hit, right? So advertisers, especially new software companies, want to have placement on these websites and they want to make money with all these visitors that are coming through. The problem is they can't tell who's lying to them about visitor metrics and who's telling the truth. And that makes it really difficult, right? Do you go with the company that claims, is 10 million hits a month but might be inflating its numbers, or the one that claims it's getting 1 million hits a month and is probably more accurate? And so it's really difficult for these advertisers to come in and for them to have any confidence in these companies unless the technology can actually change. So the adult industry's attempts to tell the difference between individual visitors and server requests helped create the data collection industry as we know it today. Through IP addresses and other pieces of individual data, server logs showed where in the world a visitor was coming from, what site brought them there, what broken links they encountered along the way, and how much time they spent on each page. These were the building blocks of targeted advertising and algorithmically generated, hyper personalized online content. Most web hosts wouldn't give complete access to this information to webmasters, and visitor counters could be easily faked if the site owner themselves placed it on the page and manipulated the numbers. Expensive serve log analysis programs were an option, but every cent counted when you were running a site in close competition with hundreds of others all over the world. In early 1996, Ron Levy, the owner of one of the biggest porn operations, Cyberotica, developed what some claim was the first third party traffic counter called XXX Counter, which site administrators couldn't manipulate. So here's why this is important. What they effectively did was unlock the internet for all manner of other businesses that wanted to advertise on the internet to come in. And they would have both the confidence that they were putting ads on sites that were actually popular and would be receiving data from those websites about who was accessing those websites, allowing them to micro target in a way you couldn't with traditional advertising, right? If you pick up a newspaper and there's an ad in that newspaper, all the newspaper can really tell is, what the newspaper tells them, which is, oh, we sell to, mostly couples, mostly, middle class suburb people. They can't really get more specific than that. But with the internet, you can get highly specific, right? You can encode information about where the person clicking on your website was last at. You can encode information about the amount of time they spend on their web page, which indicates interest. You can then micro-target even more specifically and say the highest interest people get served a completely different set of ads than the lowest interest people. And based upon that, you can also change the pricing of the ads, right? You might pay 1 penny if someone sees an ad who's low interest. You might pay 5 cents if the site gives priority to someone who's high interest. And arguably, this is kind of what Google does, where Google, when it's displaying advertisements, this was true 5 years ago. Google has really leaned into ruining the search experience. I don't know what changes they've made since then. But it works in a very similar way, where when you search something on Google, theoretically, advertisers are bidding on who gets top placement for their ad that's relevant to the person who's searching stuff. And so Google is using a very similar form of technology where it's sharing analytics with the advertisers. The advertisers decide whether or not that's a high value target. And then based upon how high of a value they think that target is, they pay more or less to have their ad given top placement. And this all happens in the fraction of a second, right? The advertisers have already pre-populated what they consider to be a high-value target. Google already has this information. Once it exchanges the information back and forth, the ad is placed in the top of your queue. That's what you see at the top of your search results. And this all started with porn sites, Naomi.
I feel like the entire internet started with porn sites. If porn hadn't been put on the internet, we wouldn't have what we have today.
Yeah. Keep in mind, this wasn't the only thing they were doing. They did banner ads. Banner ads were pretty popular. A lot of sites that were kind of big started, using third-party banner ad services and making money off of that. Unfortunately, one big problem on the internet was credit card fraud. And this could happen in two ways. Someone inputs their credit card to a website and someone steals their information and goes and uses that. Or someone inputs their credit card information and the site makes it nearly impossible to cancel it. So this caused a lot of regulation to be applied to the internet. The Federal Trade Commission, for instance, in 2000 shut down a website that was stealing people's credit card information and, again, kind of reusing it on a monthly basis, not giving them good ways to cancel. And this also allowed chargebacks to emerge as an option in online transactions. So chargebacks are claims filed by consumers to their credit card companies that charges were fraudulent. They still do plague the industry, as someone signing up for a website claiming their information was stolen, and then they get a refund for it. But it also allows the industry to regulate itself. Right? If a company is stealing stuff, people can submit all these chargeback requests, and this effectively allows people to trust that for the most part, the websites that they're accessing, that they're giving their financial information to, are not going to be, ruining their lives over it.
I had no idea that that was like the start of chargebacks. I mean, I guess that makes sense because like the only reason why people are getting like there's very few times when you go to the store and you have to get like a chargeback because of an in-store purchase. So
Yeah.
wow, learning so much.
There is one last part that I think we'll wrap up on today, and that is what happened to gin-dave.com. So they were, around throughout the advent of all this technology, and they kind of had to roll with the punches and adapt to it. So they moved to credit card billing in the late 90s after trying out different payment processors. They never made millions of dollars every single month, but for a few years they were making between $60,000 and $100,000 a year from their website. They quit their day jobs and worked on the site full time. The shift from community-driven passion project to their entire livelihood started to wear on Dave, in part because of the hundreds of emails their former Usenet friends and fans sent through the site. These people who they'd formerly shared their pictures with for free would send them emails like, "You're a sellout. You're an awful person. You planned this from the start." Like,
So little
like you're a
intent.
heroin dealer who gave someone a free
My
sample to
gosh.
hook them.
Yeah.
Yeah. He hid it from Jin initially, but it ate him up, and he didn't want to compete with the thousands of other amateur sites out there. It still makes him anxious today talking about the money they made 2 decades ago. So Jin took over the main responsibilities of keeping the site running, including HTML coding. This turned into a crisis of conscience for Dave. Dave went to a self-help seminar and was smoking cigarettes and talks to his wife, and he's like, "Look, if someone tells you what the first thing you do if someone asks you what the first thing you do if you like won the lottery is, and you say quit your job, you kind of hate your job." And so he was like, "Look, I don't really want to do this anymore." So he stepped away primarily from management, allowing her to revive it. They started experimenting with new technologies like primitive webcams that posted new photos of their apartments every few minutes. By 2000, Jen had raised the price of memberships to $15 a month and offered CD-ROM package deals of hundreds of images and dozens of videos for collectors for $35 with a 3-month subscription to the site thrown in. They went to parties thrown by other adult webmasters and hosted their other events for free, where there was no sex until there was, according to Jen. They kept banner ads to a minimum and attempted to run a site that could be a model for industry ethics. They believe that just because you posted dirty doesn't mean they would have to play dirty in the world of the adult entertainment industry. Um, Dave said that they tried to lay a good foundation and help fight the assholes who invented pop-up ads that couldn't be closed and recur building, but eventually they just kind of lost. By 2012, when a journalist for the Baltimore Sun visited their apartment to profile their cyber adventures, their popularity is rapidly waning. The internet landscape was radically different from where they had started. Massive porn conglomerates were gobbling up competition, stolen porn was a Google search away, and algorithms were feeding people exactly what they wanted. The most difficult part of the journey for Dave was admitting that it was over. He said, "At some point, I realized there'd be no more parties and I have to go back to having a day job, and that would be all." Jen still runs her own website, Jen PM, but they shuttered the original site, leaving only a love letter to their fans up on the homepage. "I was never a truly moral or ethical person," Dave says, "until I got into porn. In the process of doing something I really loved, then being called a sellout and coming to terms with that and working with truly wonderful people, I started looking at the big picture, trying to experience life with the rest of humankind."
Who knew that sex could, make you so deep?
This feels like a love story, Naomi. Right? This is like a feel good romance that goes straight to DVD.
It's like you got mail, but you've got porn.
You've got mail, MLALE. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me. You have all these, thousands of individual stories and experiences that, define the early internet. And I do think Samantha has done a really good job of, kind of collating the information and, making it a lot more digestible of a narrative. Obviously, this is, kind of a cursory overview of the entirety of technology throughout that period. But I think it's a really good, deep analysis of, the major trends and themes that run throughout this period. And I, as someone who was not as familiar with any of this technology, again, it's just very interesting seeing how the technology evolved and how that kind of changes the people using it and accessing it. Um, we don't think of any of this stuff when we use the internet today or use our phones today, but obviously it played a huge role in how the internet and phones today work. So thank God to our forefathers.
I just I'm still fascinated that the internet porn came out of this. So this has been a great learning experience for me.
Yeah, I think we'll wrap it up next time. There's a couple more little anecdotes I want to dig into. Again, I'm brushing through the majority of content in the book. If this is something that fascinates you, I would really urge you pick it up because there's some really fascinating anecdotes buried in this. A lot of kind of side stories that she peppers in throughout the main chapter. We're really brushing over what was a pivotal moment in human history, and I think she does so in a very entertaining and informative manner. So yeah, go check out the book, Samantha Cole. She's doing a great job. I hope she puts out some more content on the history of the internet, whether it's pornographic or not, just because she seems to have a good grasp of how to interview people and how to access this stuff that's very difficult to access these days. That's helpful in a world where so much is rapidly scrubbed from the internet every couple of months.
So true. So true.
Any closing thoughts?
I think that's it. I think we hope everyone has a great week. We appreciate you listening, and we will see you back next week, hopefully, for another episode of How Sex Changed the Internet.
Mm-hmm. And I just got to say, Naomi, I have consumed a third of this can of Monster, and I feel like a demigod. I feel I could accomplish the 12 labors of Hercules. I could slay the Hydra. I could clean out the Limian stables. I could, arm wrestle Zeus. I could do it all. I'm ready for my day. I might never sleep again. This is the greatest concoction in the history of drinks, and I hope that everyone can experience the euphoria I'm currently experiencing.
Red Bull gives you wings, but Monster makes you into Percy Jackson.
Not going to get better than that. Bye, y'all.